Hello there, friends. I'm Danny J. Norwell, author of Fairly Familiar and Snapshots of Spain, and it is December, so today I wanted to share with you the top 10 books that I read in 2022. Now, before I get into the list, I want to be super clear with you that most of these books did not come out in 2022. I do not limit myself to new releases because I just think that would be such a shame. There's so many incredible books that came out before this year, so obviously that will be something that affects my list, as well as the fact that I'm simply going to go through these 10 books in the order that I read them. So the genres will not be evenly spread out. There's no rhyme or reason the first one was not better than the last one, etc., etc. Let's just jump into it. First on my list is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste. This was actually the very first book I read of 2022. So it's been a long time, but this book is still on my mind and it's still one of the books that I recommend to a ton of people. It's a young adult novel, it's suspenseful, but it's also got some historical fiction elements to it. It is just a really beautiful look into life and how a Asian American family is affected by the daughter going missing. So without giving you any spoilers, I highly recommend this one. Number 2 for me was 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Now, as the king of horror novels, you might think that this novel is horror related, but it really is not. 11/22/63 is the day that JFK was shot. And so this book is a historical fiction mixed with time travel, mixed with sci-fi. It is a really wild ride. I listened as an audiobook. It was about 30 hours long, but I was invested until the very end. I actually enjoyed the note from the author at the end just as much as I enjoyed the story itself. And so even if you've watched the miniseries made from this book, I highly recommend checking out the book itself because the way Stephen King writes it is just phenomenal. Book number 2 is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is actually the first novel of Elizabeth Gilbert's that I ever read, and I am now a huge fan of her work. This book was just fun. That is the best way that I could describe it. It's whimsical, it's exciting, it's just fun. The characters are great. It takes place in the 1920s, and so that in and of itself is exciting, but I just think it's a beautiful mix of historical fiction and women's fiction at its finest. Number 4 is Autoboyography by Christina Lauren. This was a young adult novel that really allowed me to get to know and get to understand people with different identities to myself. So it follows 2 queer teenagers in a very Mormon-centric environment, and those are 2 lifestyles that I'm not as familiar with. So I think that the authors did an incredible job of taking a look at what life is like for queer teens, what that process and that coming of age time period can be like, especially when the Mormon religion is involved. Book number 5 for me was This Is My America by Kim Johnson. This is one heavy-hitting young adult novel. I was so excited when I heard about this story, and it definitely met and exceeded my expectations as a debut novel from this author. This Is My America deals with the broken U.S. justice system. It deals with wrongful convictions, institutionalized racism, and so much more, but it's really delivered in an exciting, fast-paced, kind of suspenseful crime novel-esque manner. And I just think that the way that it dealt with these really heavy topics in a way that was accessible to a young adult audience was top-notch, and I highly recommend this BIPOC author's novel. I also recommend book number 6, which was Yearbook by Seth Rogen. Now, this is a total 180 from the heavier topics that I was talking about in This Is My America, but Yearbook is a memoir written by actor Seth Rogen, actor, director, producer, all of those things, and I'll be quite honest with you, I am not the world's biggest Seth Rogen fan. I simply got this in a Audible bundle, and I highly recommend this book if you just need a laugh, if you need something light. definitely check it out in audiobook as well, because Seth Rogen is an incredible storyteller as it is, so he was pulling me in with each and every anecdote. But I think what really made this special is that he narrates the story himself, and he also has a lot of the people in his stories, which are a lot of famous people that you're going to be familiar with, coming in and narrating the parts that have to do with them. And I just think that is such a cool thing that I've never seen, or I've personally never experienced with audiobooks before, but it just added such a light, comical, fun, exciting aspect to this audiobook. Number 7 for me was The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. This is a quintessential women's fiction novel. Many people will also categorize it as historical fiction, but in truth it takes place in 1980, the year's 1980s. So when it was written, it was not historical fiction. But it does look back at the mother's pasts as well. So this is a really powerful look at mother-daughter relationships and just women and how they come to be who they are over time. And I think it's one of the only books I've read, at least in recent years, where I got to the end of the book and I thought to myself, wow, I would like to read this again, because I think the second time through it'll be even more powerful. It was sometimes difficult to follow the different mothers and daughter pairings. I wasn't as certain as to who was who at all times, but once I got to the second half of the book, I did have a lot more of that understanding, and that's why I think that reading this one again would be a really wonderful experience. Number 8 is To the Grave by Caitlin Moss. Now this book was actually written in 2022, and it is by an indie author like myself, women's fiction, and just breathtaking, heart-wrenching, laugh out loud kind of story. It follows 3 best friends as they go through some really pivotal life changes. Some of them involve their relationship, some involve health, some involve past secrets, and it really just tests their friendship in a way that felt so real and raw to me. These girls are, your quintessential squad goals, but they're flawed. They are real people who make mistakes, and I just think that the author did an incredible job of painting this picture. And I'll say that I cried at the end of this book, which I can be emotional, but it usually is when it comes to TV and movies and more of that visceral experience. It's not often that I cry from a book. This year, the only ones that made me do that were To the Grave and City of Girls. So if you are looking for an emotional read, I highly recommend To the Grave. My 9th recommendation for you is Imposter by Bradeigh Godfrey. This is also a newer release, and this book sent me on a wild ride. I wasn't really sure what I was getting myself into. I saw this one recommended by a bookstagrammer, and because it takes place in Chicago and because it's a bit of a thriller, suspense novel, I just went all in without reading that much about it, and it really, really impressed me. I could not stop talking about this book. It is like a medical trauma that has a huge impact on the suspense and finding out. I can't even talk about it without giving spoilers, so let me just say, read this book. You will not be disappointed. It is really intricate. It has so many twists and turns, and it will keep you guessing to the very end. Finally, book number 10 for me was Big Friendship by Aminatou and Anne Friedman. I was a little bit apprehensive about putting this book on my list because it is the only book of these 10 that I gave 4 stars to instead of 5. But really that was just about my expectations not being exactly met in the way that the book ended and like the payoff that I thought we were going to get. However, it's one book that has really impacted the way that I think, and I think it'll actually have quite a bit influence on my life. In fact, a number of my friends and I are going to be discussing this book soon because it is that important. The authors managed to provide a very theoretical, nonfiction, relationship-based story alongside the narrative of their own friendship. And I think that that dichotomy was very interesting. I think that it could have been done a little bit better at the end, but I loved learning about relationships and why we have the closeness we have, what that takes, and what that looks like in our own lives. So if you are at all curious about things like this, I recommend it to you as well. So those are my 10 favorite books that I read in 2022. But before I go, I wanted to do a special mention of 2 other books that I very, very much enjoyed, but are sequels. And I wanted to avoid putting sequels in my top 10 because to me these were 10 books that I thought you might want to just like select and go ahead and read straight away, whereas these last 2 books are ones where you really do need to read their predecessors first. And that is Follow the Blue Rabbit, which is the sequel to Follow the Hummingbird by Elena Carter. This book is beautiful. It is mainly an urban fantasy, but personally I consider it women's fiction as well, because yes, it takes place in the magical dream worlds realm, but it also takes place in real life where people are dealing with real everyday problems like grief and relationships. And so I highly recommend this series, but it is very important to read the first one as well. So check both of those books out by Elena Carter. And finally, I also wanted to give an honorable mention to Heavy is the Head, Kingdom Come, which is the sequel to Heavy is the Head, Love and War by Katrina and Lewis. This series is beautifully written, and it is changing my mind on how I feel about romance and fantasy every single time I come to it. This author does a really, really nice job of, that fantasy world building and all of that stuff that fantasy readers look for. That's not all that important to me. I am obsessed with the relationships. There's a really intricate and interesting love triangle going on. There are some extenuating family dynamics. There's lust for power. There's just a little bit of everything in this book. And then on top of that, the author is also able to weave in so many elements of African and African American culture, which I just think is so cool and so underrepresented in the fantasy and romance genres. So be sure to check out Heavy is the Head. This is a duology, so if you read both of those, you'll have read the whole series. Those are my favorite books, so with the honorable mentions, you have a full dozen for you. This was a wonderful year of reading, and I hope it was for you too. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books or what your top books of 2022 were. I'm always looking for new reads. Oh, one last thing. I actually use my YouTube channel much more for writer talks, where I talk about the process of writing and self-publishing, and so these sorts of book reviews are not my typical content production. However, I do have a backlog of book reviews that are exclusive to my mailing list subscribers. So if you enjoyed this and you would like even more in-depth reviews of specific books, I would encourage you to get on my mailing list. I will include the link in the description down below. Once you get on my list, I'll give you the access code to enter into my website, where you can access all of the free content, including those book reviews and some other writer-related content as well. Thanks, and have a great day! Not palatable, that's a horrible way of saying it. Follow the Blue Rabbit, which is the sequel to Follow the Hummingbird by